Welcome. It may seem odd that in the last video we learned about the French and Indian War when we are in a unit focused on the American Revolution, but they are indeed connected. Today we are going to be learning about how the French and Indian War indirectly caused the American Revolution. Our learning targets for today are to be able to explain how Parliament and the King tried to pay off its debt from the French and Indian War, and to be able to describe how both the colonists and the king escalated their problems leading up to the Revolutionary War. So, when we left off, the French and Indian War had come to an end, and the British had successfully beaten the French and gained new land. However, that win came with a ton of debt and the added expense of maintaining and protecting the new territory. As we know from the previous video, when a government needs money, they can't just print it. They have to collect taxes. This is what the king and parliament intended to do: tax their citizens to pay off the debt. And remember, the colonists were still British citizens. The king believed that because Great Britain had provided resources to protect the colonists, it was only fair that the colonists helped to foot the bill. The first tax Parliament levied was the Sugar Act. On April 5, 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, which placed a tax on sugar and molasses that was being imported into the colonies. It also attempted to stop the colonists from smuggling sugar into the colonies from countries other than Great Britain. Next came the Stamp Act. This act, which required many paper products to be printed on paper that was embossed with a stamp, was passed on March 22, 1765. The purpose of the stamped paper, which was imported from London, was to prove it was purchased from Great Britain and not from other countries. Again, the goal was to stop colonists from getting their materials from other countries and have to purchase it from Great Britain. The third tax levied by Parliament were the Townshend Acts, which were passed in 1767 and 1768. These acts put new taxes on paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. Over time, trouble had began to brew within the colonies. Many colonists in New England were speaking out against the king. Some colonists remained loyal, and they were called loyalists, while others began to argue that the colonies should separate themselves from Great Britain to become their own country. As tensions rose, the king ordered more military presence in the colonies, which only served to make the problem worse. The colonists felt threatened, and as if he was trying to silence them. Trouble came to a head in Boston, Massachusetts on March 5, 1770. On this day, protesters and soldiers were out in the street when a snowball was thrown at a soldier. In the chaos, the soldiers shot into the crowd, killing 5 people, including a child. As more taxes were collected, the colonies became more and more upset. In order to diffuse some of the tensions, the king repealed most of the Townshend Acts, leaving only the Tea Act in 1773. This act taxed all but one brand of British tea, and tea was a huge part of the colonist culture, so this didn't go over well in the colonies. Before all of these taxes had been passed on to the colonies, most of the colonists were content being British citizens. They were able to live their everyday lives without much government interference, and they liked it that way. However, with each new tax, the colonists grew more and more angry with what they felt was unfair government intervention. For over 100 years, they had successfully maintained the colonies and made money for England and themselves. They ran their own local governments and collected their own taxes. Now, the king was interfering with their livelihood, and the colonists felt that they had no say in the matter. You see, Parliament is made up of representatives who are supposed to look out for the best interests of the citizens and take their input into account. That is how a representative government works. However, the colonies were over 3,000 miles away, which was too far for them to have a representative looking out for them. Two growing mantras in the colonies became no taxation without representation, and taxation without representation is tyranny. These basically meant that they didn't feel they should have to pay taxes if nobody was looking out for their best interests. As I said before, though, in the king's eyes, the colonists were British citizens who enjoyed the protection that the king provided, and it was right and fair for them to pay their fair share. To fight back against the tax on tea, colonists in Boston dressed as Native Americans on the night of December 16, 1773, and climbed onto the ships in the Boston harbor. They dumped hundreds of crates of tea into the harbor that night so that it couldn't be sold to the colonists, and Great Britain would be stuck with the bill. This became known as the Boston Tea Party, and it didn't go well with the king. Great Britain wouldn't tolerate such bad behavior from its colonies. In retaliation for the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed new laws directed at Massachusetts in 1774. They were dubbed the Coercive Acts because they were meant to force colonists to behave. These laws closed Boston's port for trade until the tea was paid off. Limits were placed on the Massachusetts legislature, and some colonists had to feed and house the British soldiers. In addition, the Quebec Act set rules for the lands in the Ohio Valley that had just been acquired from the French. It stated that colonists were not allowed to settle westward, and the land would be left for the Native Americans to settle. Colonists nicknamed these new laws the Intolerable Acts.